Midweek Murders contains graphic and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised.
Yeah, you loser.
Speaking of losers, how's your day been? No, I'm just kidding.
Uneventful is how my day has been.
I have a feeling I might keep you on the phone for a while today because I feel a bit depressed, and this is the only plans I have had for the entirety of the Yep. And also, I don't have 2 days to edit the episode. So if I take 3 hours on this, I don't mind.
So what you're saying is this is going to be full of burps and toilet breaks.
That is the gist of it, yeah. Also, I've thought about one thing, and that is that you have a tendency to duck out when you're laughing, like duck away from the microphone.
Well, I can't duck away from the microphone because it's fixed to my headset.
Oh.
So your thought is full of poop.
Yeah, maybe it's because my laughter is so fucking loud. It mutes you. It mutes you.
Or maybe because I usually laugh silently.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm not a loud laugher. I'm not you. That's my impression of you laughing. Do you know what day it is?
It's Wednesday, which means that it's time to talk about crime. I'm your host, Sandra.
And I'm your host, the Miserable Bastard.
That's Joe, by the way.
They know who it is.
Do they?
We don't get any new listeners.
Some people listen to just one episode, then they don't know who you are, although you are the miserable bastard, so...
Well, there you go then. Problem solved.
The miserable bastard is Joe.
Bonjour!
Today we're going to talk about the murders of Beryl and Geraldine Evans. I got my information from Wikipedia, an article on Medium by Andrew Paul Shakespeare, an article on Wales Online by Jason Evans, an article in the Montreal Gazette from 1953, and allthat'sinteresting.com, and a House of Lords debate from 1966.
I got my sources from the WikiWikiWa, a parliamentary debate from 1961.
Ooh.
And some other places that I do not remember, but will be available on the website midweekmurders.netlify.app.
True story, bruh.
You're lucky that I remembered.
So, Timothy Evans entered a police station in the south of Wales on the 13th...
Merthyr Tydfil.
What?
That's the police station, Merthyr Tydfil.
Oh. I didn't write it down because I didn't think I would be able to pronounce it.
Merthyr
Tydfil.
Tydfil. Merthyr Tydfil.
Merthyr Tydfil.
Exactly. Now with a Welsh accent. Merthyr Tydfil.
Entered a police station in the south of...
you bitch.
In the south of Wales on the 30th of November 1949, telling the police that he was worried about his 18-month-old daughter, Geraldine. The police asked him where the mother of the child was, to which he answered that she had died in unusual circumstances. He went on to tell police that his wife Beryl had been pregnant, but the couple had decided on an abortion which was illegal at the time, as they couldn't handle the financial strain of a second child. He then told police that he had been given a bottle of some unknown liquid by a man who had told him that this would lead to a termination of the pregnancy. He stated that Beryl had drunk the contents of the mystery bottle and had died shortly after. He claimed that he had then disposed of Beryl's body by putting it down a manhole situated outside the couple's home in Notting Hill, London. He also said that he had arranged for somebody to take care of Geraldine before going back to his hometown in Wales. In Wales, his relatives had become worried for his wife and daughter as they suspected that Timothy had abandoned them because of the pregnancy. They wanted to know where his daughter was, and as Timothy failed to locate her, they persuaded him to go to the police. So the police searched the home at number 10 Rillington Place and realized that the manhole cover required 3 men to remove. Also, they did not find a body down there.
They did not find nobody.
Timothy then recanted his quote-unquote confession and told the police that his downstairs neighbor had offered to perform an abortion on Beryl. Timothy now told them that he had returned from work on the 8th of November, the day that the quote-unquote abortion was supposed to have taken place, to the news that his wife had died due to complications. His neighbor, John Christie, informed him that he would put Beryl's body down the manhole and make sure Geraldine was taken care of by giving her up for adoption. Christie then urged Timothy to get out of London and lay low somewhere, as he claimed that the police would be looking for him. The police returned to Rillington Place to perform a second search of the home, and this time they found the bodies of both Beryl and Geraldine wrapped in a tablecloth in the wash house situated in the garden. They had both been strangled. I'm guessing that a wash house is a house in the garden with like some kind of laundry.
Yeah, I think it all would have been external to the main house.
Mm-hmm. Timothy had been in solitary confinement for 2 days before he was shown articles of clothing that the bodies had been wearing and identified them as belonging to Beryl and Geraldine. He was then interrogated for hours and threatened with violence should he not cooperate. They wanted him to sign the confession. The confession they wanted him to sign, though, stated that he had strangled Beryl on the 8th following an argument, and then 2 days later murdered his daughter before traveling to Wales. And Timothy was described as having the IQ of a 12-year-old and was more or less illiterate. The confession, however, was coherent and worded in a way that makes it implausible that Timothy had much input in what it said at all. And with this, I kind of mean that it sounded like it was put in a narrative that the police wanted things to have happened.
Yeah, so I think it was examined later, not at the time, and they found that there were, quote, linguistic discrepancies between what you would expect someone with the IQ of between 10 and 12 to be able to articulate and common phraseology that the police would use.
Yeah.
So obviously you would need to be of a certain IQ to be able to register to be in the police. And that linguistic investigation found that the written statement from Timothy didn't match with the IQ levels of his reported ability.
Mm-hmm. The thing that was also a problem was that Timothy, when he left school, he could more or less write his name. That was it.
Yeah, I mean, you see a confession that's been doctored by the police. So when you write a confession, it has to be your own words.
Mm-hmm.
And for someone illiterate, obviously they would have had to dictate it. But at the same time, you would expect that level of dictation to be the same. Wow, your noise cancelling headphones did not cancel that out.
I just opened the door. Sorry.
I heard that clearly. So yeah, the level of his IQ means that he wouldn't have been able to write, which means that he would have had to dictate his statement. But also, given his level of IQ, he wouldn't have been able to come up with complex sentence structures or words that weren't necessarily in the common vernacular. And so when you look at the statement and compare it to what you would expect to come from a 10 to 12-year-old child, which was his mental ability, there were obvious signs that this didn't correlate particularly strongly.
Mm-hmm. Timothy Evans was put on trial for the murder of his daughter on the 11th of January 1950. At this point, he had withdrawn the signed confession on the advice of his lawyer. He claimed that his second confession had been truthful and that John Christie, his neighbour, was the culprit. The prosecution laughed this off in court as fantastic, even though Christie had previously served 6 months in jail for hitting a woman in the head with a cricket bat. What's more is that people living at number 10 Rillington Place could only access the wash house by using a knife to unlock it. That knife was in the possession of Ethel Christie, John's wife. Which I feel like is weird, because how the hell do you have an outhouse that is just unlocked with a knife? Not a key, a knife. I'm like, that is weird.
I feel like it's a very basic latch mechanism that latches from the inside, and so the only way to open it is to put a knife to be able to release the latch.
That makes sense, that it was like an inside job.
Yeah, like a poorly designed or broken latch mechanism seems to be the only way that would make sense.
Mm-hmm. I also read that it was like in adjacent to their flat, John Christie and Ethel's flat, adjacent to their kitchen. So probably they could open it from the inside, maybe.
Yeah, there might have been an alternative route in.
Mm-hmm. So the Notting Hill police had also talked to some builders who were making repairs to number 10 Rillington Place at the time when the murders took place. The builders had stored their tools in the wash house and assured the police that the bodies had not been there when Timothy had left for Wales, as they had thoroughly cleaned it out when they finished work on the 11th of November.
Yeah, so it's theorized that Beryl was killed on the 8th.
Yeah.
Geraldine was killed on the 10th. The builders would have cleaned the outhouse on the 11th and then would have given the spare timber on the 14th.
Okay. And also, noticeably, Timothy traveled to Wales on the 10th, I think.
Yeah, and was theorized to have hidden Beryl between the 8th and the 10th.
Yeah. So the police forced the builders to amend their statements, and they were not summoned to give evidence in court.
Also, the workers' timesheet was a piece of evidence that was submitted to the police to corroborate the workers' story that they'd been working at least until the 11th. So they submitted that to the police, and then the police conveniently lost it.
Oh, did they?
Yes, they did. And then got the workers to change it from there were definitely no bodies on the 11th when they cleared the wash house to they did not see any bodies, but that does not mean there were not any.
I'm quite sure that they would have.
Oh, they definitely would have found any bodies. And the fact that the police conveniently lost this piece of evidence that irrefutably cleared Timothy and showed that he couldn't have dumped the bodies in the wash house in the times that the police are indicating he could, because it didn't fit with their theories.
Yeah.
Boo you, Popo. Boo you.
Eloquently said. So John and Ethel Christie were the prosecutor's key witnesses. John denied having offered to help terminate Beryl's pregnancy, and in turn offered up evidence of Timothy's and Beryl's frequent loud arguments. Apparently, Timothy might have had an alcohol issue. He might have been physical in those arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And the other neighbors could attest to this as well, which does sound damning. It does statistically make sense. I'm not surprised that the police believed this theory, because
No, I'm not either.
Very common.
Yeah, it doesn't take a leap of logic to come to that conclusion, but also there is a history of domestic abuse, therefore the husband did it is not okay. There is a history of domestic abuse, therefore husband is prime suspect. No problem with that. As long as it's investigated fully and sufficiently, looking at you, Crown Court, in this case.
The jury were reportedly also swayed by the fact that John Christie had been a volunteer part-time police officer during World War II, which is funny because our last case, he was also a part-time police officer.
So what we're saying is all PCSOs are murderers.
So much of the evidence collected during the investigation was never showed to the jury, and they took only 40 minutes to reach a guilty verdict. Timothy Evans was hanged on the 9th of March 1950, which is also my birthday, so happy birthday to me. Not.
It's my birthday, I can cry if I want to.
3 years later, John Christie was discovered to be a serial killer. He had moved out of his flat, and when an upstairs neighbor had started using the Christie's kitchen, he discovered the bodies of 3 women, Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan, hidden in a concealed kitchen pantry. And with concealed, I mean, I think they kind of plastered the wall, but not plastered just with paper. Paper the wall, which is weird, but I think that was it. No?
I don't know.
So, John Christie, I did read about his childhood, blah, blah, blah. I felt like some of the things from his childhood was worth mentioning. His father was very strict. He was also mentioned to have an overprotective mother, which I was like, who doesn't have an overprotective mother? He was also called to have been teased by his sisters, older sisters. I'm like, all siblings tease their younger siblings. That's just what siblings are. Did you get teased by your siblings?
All the time.
Yeah, you just have one older sibling, but let me tell you, that's what siblings are. No?
I mean, my mum wasn't overprotective. She popped me out from her vag and was like, there you go, there's the world, fend for yourself.
I mean, like, my mother was very overprotective. That's life. I'm gonna deal with it, mate.
That's what all the people say. Riding high in April, shut down in May.
He also had a lifelong problem with impotence. And he was branded as Reggie No Dick and Can't Do It Christie.
Oh.
Which I feel like should be what we call serial killers.
I fucking love Can't Do It, Christie. That's great.
That's great. We should dub him that, because what the fuck is his deal? He's a pathetic man. Can't Do It, Christie. Great moniker. Like, we should call Golden State Killer Small Dick Joe, because he has a small dick.
Hey! Some of us are genetically predisposed.
But he should be called that, because Golden State Killer is a bit menacing. We should just call him Small Dick Joe, because people who have been assaulted by him have described it as a very small dick. We should call him Small Dick Joe. We should call the Zodiac Killer Can't Spell Paradise, because they recently... Did you read about this?
I've read that they decoded some of his letters.
Yeah, they decoded a coded letter from him very recently, and turns out he can't spell paradise.
I don't think that will catch on. You probably should have worked on that a bit harder before publicising it to the world.
True story, but we should call him Can't Spell Paradise, because he can't fucking spell. Or maybe Zodiac Can't Spell. That'll be good.
Needs work. I get your point. Work a bit harder on the Zodiac.
So, during a further search done by police, 3 more bodies were discovered. Christie's wife, Ethel, Ruth First, an Austrian nurse, and Muriel Edie, a former colleague of John Christie. And they were buried, not his wife, but the other 2 were buried in shallow graves in the garden, which should have been discovered when they looked for Beryl and Geraldine.
Was this the one where there was a thigh bone propping up his garden trellis?
Yes.
And the police came out of that search and they were like, nah, nothing suspicious in the garden. It's all good.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, fucking hell, mate, it's a thigh bone.
In a fence, yes.
Somebody needs a better prescription in their glasses.
And also, one of their skulls were reportedly discovered by children in the area.
Oh yeah, that they submitted to the police.
Yeah.
And the police were like, ooh, random skull? Nah, can't be relevant.
Yeah, exactly. All 6 victims had been strangled and wrapped up in fabric, just like Beryl and Geraldine. John Christie then confessed to the murder of Beryl Evans on 4 different occasions, but he never confessed to the murder of Geraldine. But everybody knew.
Everybody knew, apart from the people that were involved in his prosecution, because everybody that were involved in his prosecution said that he only pleaded guilty for murdering Beryl to rack up the number of people he killed to support his claim of insanity.
Oh.
That's the only reason that they were like, oh yeah, you killed Beryl, did you? Because you're insane. They weren't like, oh, Beryl died. Same MO as all the other victims that you murdered and stashed away in your house. Must have been you. No, it was like, Beryl, yeah, only claiming that to get away with insanity. Fucking 1950s judicial system was fucking rigged, mate.
Although he did confess to necrophilia on Beryl and on the other victims.
Well, that's an interesting point as well. Dr. Tier, I think his name is pronounced. So he was the guy that did the autopsy of Beryl. And there are multiple sources out there saying that the evidence he gave at trial has been disputed, both at the time and afterwards. So he said that he found vaginal bruising, which coincides with all of the other Christie victims. Either at the time or just after the trial, he said he couldn't be sure whether that bruising was inflicted pre or post mortem.
Mm-hmm.
To be fair to Dr. Teal, it is quite hard to determine the exact time that bruising would occur, mainly because the body will naturally bruise post-mortem, which is how you can tell if a body has been moved post-mortem. So if you imagine your body's pumping all your blood around, happy as Larry, la la la, your heart's like, boop doop doo, pump pump pump, yeah, pump pump pump, look at me, I'm alive, I'm so happy, pump pump pump. And then it dies.
Very abrupt.
Pump pump pump. Oh. If you're laying down on your back, naturally gravity will cause all of your blood to pool on your back and the back of your legs and so on. So if someone's died on their back and then been moved post-mortem somewhere else and been laid on their stomach, a forensic pathologist will be able to tell that this body has been moved because all of the blood pooling is on their back. Now, when you get more localized to things like vaginal bruising, which are very common in forced sexual situations, it's a lot harder to tell whether that's been inflicted pre or post-mortem because of the higher rate of blood flow and the fact that the blood flow will naturally pull downwards towards the anus. But the indication that there was bruising in the internal walls of the vaginal canal would indicate that the penetration occurred during life or very soon after death, which kind of doesn't lean towards the necrophilia that has been reported and was supposedly confessed. There's one way that would have been the easiest to prove Timothy's innocence and Christie's guilt. And that would have been to test the seminal fluid that was recovered forensically from Beryl's vaginal cavity.
Was there seminal?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
They didn't test it.
John Christie was executed on the 15th of July, 1953. By the same hangman who had executed Timothy Evans. As the noose was lowered over John Christie's head, he complained about his nose itching, which he couldn't do anything about, seeing as his hands were tied behind his back. The hangman replied, "It won't bother you for long," which is a great bit of morbid banter. Did I tell you about John Christie's hypochondriac?
Hippopotamus?
Hippopotamusm. Hypochondriacism. Hypochondriac. Puppy. Penile.
Self-diagnosis of multiple diseases.
What is it called? Hypochondriac.
Ism.
What is it called?
I don't know what the present participle of it is.
Okay, he was a hypochondriac, and he reportedly said that he had been gassed with mustard gas when he was in World War I, because apparently he had been a soldier in World War I. And also, speaking of which, his photo of him in the 1950s-ish, he looks like a proper serial killer.
Whereas I've seen Timothy, and quite a handsome chap.
Yeah, he looks mostly confused.
Yeah, more handsome than the rugged, handsome officer Neville Heath, who was handsome and rugged and handsome, who looked like a troglodyte. Timothy, not a bad-looking fella.
No, not really. No, he looked wicked. But also, John Christie looked like a serial killer in the photos from the 1950s, because he was, obviously. But also his eyes are, like, creepy. But he was a hypochondriac. Hippopotamus. Hippopotamus.
Hippopotamus.
Because he was like oh my god, the mustard gas in World War One made me both deaf and mute. And then he was like, yeah.
I didn't know about this.
3 years later, he was like, I can only speak in whisper tones. I can't raise my voice.
I can only speak in Swahili.
Yeah, he was like, I can only speak in whispers because I've been mustard gassed. It affected my voice as such that I can only whisper.
I can see why you were chosen for live performances.
Obviously, that's psychosomatic. But also, it's funny because he was like, oh, I'm such a fragile old man. I've never done anything. And then he was a fucking serial killer.
So I've got some points on the inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you looked into that at all.
What was the inquiry?
So later on, after Christie had been found guilty, there were 2 inquiries into whether there had been a miscarriage of justice in sentencing Timothy to death. One of them was conducted by a chap called Henderson. He looked at all of the evidence that was available at the time to the jury and any evidence that had come forth afterwards, such as the conviction and evidence against Christie. The esteemed Mr. Henderson, he might have been a sir, found that there were no grounds at all to consider any reasonable doubt that Timothy might not have been guilty.
What?
So he upheld the conviction. And I spent about an hour reading through a Commons debate between a bunch of politicians that was like, oh, the right honourable gentleman is wrong. Or the right honourable gentleman insults this right honourable gentleman. Oh, the right honourable gentleman that's insulted has misinterpreted the right honourable gentleman. But basically, in the midst of all of the right honourable gentlemanism-ing, they came to the conclusion that there were 5 points in the original conviction that could be questioned. Number 1 is that Timothy did not report his dead wife after coming home from work. Now, if you were innocent, you'd do that, right?
Yeah, but also abortion was illegal back then.
Oh, you mean if Beryl had died from the abortion process?
Which he thought that she did, because John Christie had tried to convince them that he had the medical knowledge of doing an abortion.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Number 2 is that the timesheet of the workmen that were working in the wash house went missing.
Mm-hmm.
Number 3 is that the defense lawyers, so Timothy's lawyers, were convinced of his guilt and therefore did not push for certain pieces of evidence to be presented in court, such as the seminal fluid recovered in Beryl's vag.
Say vagina.
Vagini.
No, say vagina. Fuck's sake. I'm just gonna have a problem cutting this.
The shoo-shoo.
Did you read anything about the...
I haven't finished yet. I've got 3 more points, mate.
Okay, I'm with you. Okay.
Yeah,
say
stop
vagina,
fucking...
for fuck's sake.
Stop fucking interrupting me.
Vagina.
Stop shouting it. I'm sensitive. Stop encouraging me.
I'm not encouraging you. You're encouraging you. You're doing this to yourself. I need to pee.
I'm over it. It's fine. It's totally fine. Number 4 was supposedly the judge during the trial gave a biased summary to the jury. So when you've got a jury at trial, before the judge sends off the jury to come to their decision, he's meant to give a summary of all of the evidence that's been heard, both prosecution and defense. In this case, apparently, I haven't read it myself, the judge gave a skewed opinion which favoured the prosecution. So in the jury's mind, they were already linking the evidence in the prosecution's favour rather than the defence. And the final point is that given that Christie was a main prosecution witness in Timothy's trial, the jury would have had a predisposition to favour someone of intellect, which was exacerbated and played upon by the prosecution team against Timothy's lower IQ.
In 1966, Timothy Evans received the royal pardon.
I've got a couple more points on the first inquiry. So when they were looking at the first inquiry that was conducted by Henderson, there was a lot of debate about a lot of the findings. One of the politicians was looking through the report and said there's a number of assumptions that you have to work on to be able to support the conviction that was given. The first assumption is that there are 2 killers working with the same modus operandi. You then have to assume that these 2 killers were in the same house, a floor apart, but were working independently and in ignorance of the other. You then have to assume that one of these people killed 6 victims and one of these people killed only 1.
2.
No, he was only charged for 1. He wasn't charged for Beryl.
Oh yeah.
You then have to assume that it was complete chance that Evans wrapped the body in the exact same way that Christie wrapped his victims. And then you have to assume that it was complete chance that during the trial, Evans accused Christie of the murders. Now, when you put all of those together, that's a ridiculous amount of assuming that needs to be involved for it to be plausible that Christie committed all of his crimes that he confessed to and was also linked to, and that Evans committed the crime of murdering Geraldine and also Beryl that he wasn't convicted for. So just on that basis alone, it's ridiculous.
It's implausible, yeah.
Yeah, they went on to say during the trial, so they took into account Evans' confession, which said that both Beryl and Geraldine had been hidden behind the sink in the wash house, behind a bunch of timber, and that they'd both been strangled. When that was questioned, the chief inspector at the time said that he did not disclose any of this information to Timothy Evans when interviewing him. Then they interviewed his second in command, who, when asked, did Chief Inspector Jennings state that the bodies were hidden behind the sink? He said, under oath, yes, sir. Then when he was asked, did Chief Inspector Jennings disclose that the bodies were hidden behind the timber framing? He replied, under oath, yes, sir. So the confession, which supposedly contained information that only the murderer would know, was divulged by the chief inspector when deliberately questioning Timothy Evans to try and get a confession out of him. The final point about the inquiry was that the defense lawyers that were hired by Timothy's mother, I think it was, and sister or sister-in-law, there were a couple of people that were close family that had hired the lawyers to represent them for the inquiry. to start off with, that defence lawyer had been given a date by the prosecution that he was to attend court. And he was fine with that. He was happy with it. He turned up and they said, actually, they changed your court date. It's a different day now. So the defence lawyer then missed out on, I think it was 3 days of the inquiry.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
That's like in Harry Potter.
Yeah, when they change it to that morning and then he just has to turn up.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. So the defence lawyer, I think his name was Gill. I'm going to call him Gill. So Gill asked the court to see the evidence from the days that he missed and the days that he was not allowed to attend. This was refused by Mr. Henderson, the person conducting the inquiry. So then Gill said that he wanted access to Timothy Evans' original statements and all of the transcripts from the original trial, and Mr. Henderson refused. So then Gill said, okay, so I want to call some defence witnesses. So Mr. Henderson said, okay, that's fine, but you, Mr. Gill, are not allowed to question them directly.
What?
You have to submit your questions to me, Mr. Henderson, and I will choose whether to ask them or not.
What? What
Yeah.
the fuck?
So there was a massive debate in the House of Commons as to whether Henderson's inquiry was valid or not. And obviously, given what you said earlier, they managed to get it to a second inquiry, which managed to redact the sentence on Timothy.
But also, an independent assessor of the Home Office said that the conviction of Timothy Evans is now recognized to have been one of the most notorious, if not the most notorious, miscarriages of justice. And that's the case.
It's also interesting that this case was used very heavily in the argument for abolishing capital punishment in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks, Timothy, you stopped us all from getting decaffeinated.
Definitely, yes. What are you gonna do now?
What's the time? Oh, shitting hell. It's
11:30.
11. Probably sleep.
I thought that I should do a board game.
Little dance. Make a little love. Get down tonight. Ba-chow, ba-chow. Get down
A board
tonight.
game
Ba-chow, ba-chow.
thing with our listeners.
How does that
Just-
work?
With video. Suzanne and Lee and Joe and the others.
The Russian bots.
Hmm.
I don't get it.
Maybe we should do a board game night.
Maybe we should have a strip poker night.
Could do that and then put it on Patreon.
Yeah, exactly. Or OnlyFans. Midweek Murders OnlyFans.
Okay, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Midweek Murders. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Are we going?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, okay.
See you never.
See you not soon.